everybody, and welcome to Your Spiritual Best Friend on Spotify or wherever you guys are listening to the podcast. I am the host, Josh Sanchez, and the purpose of Your Spiritual Best Friend is to connect spirituality, mental health, and astrology all in one, because it's important for everyone to realize that we are all on our own spiritual journey at the end of the day. So the more we open up, the more we are able to connect with each other and grow as a collective society. So sit back and relax and enjoy Your Spiritual Best Friend. Hey everybody, and welcome back to the podcast. On today's episode, I got a chance to interview special guest Yogi Aaron. Yogi is a professional yoga instructor and has been working with many clients for a very long time. What me and Aaron get into it for our podcast, we talk a lot about his journey, what got him into yoga, and his overall journey from working in New York to working now in Costa Rica, where he has been there for a couple years now. Aaron really opens up and is very open with his experiences. So if you guys are really interested into yoga, the ins and outs, the mental mindset that goes on with yoga, we really get in depth and with that as well. We also talk about relationships and how we're always learning through the people we're meeting, whether that is friends, family, romantic partners. We're always learning something through our relationships. So me and him really get into that as well. But you can check out all of Aaron's work by clicking in the links in the show description. If you guys ever take a trip to Costa Rica, definitely reach out to Aaron and he'll hook you up, especially with some yoga lessons. But like always, guys, please like, rate, and subscribe to the podcast. I know I have been posting less frequently, but I know within the next couple weeks, I'm going to start reamping and posting more podcasts. Just been busy, with a lot of school and work and practicum and just all that stuff, of growing and learning at the same time. But like always, guys, like, rate, and subscribe to the podcast. And without further ado, here is my conversation with Yogi Aaron. Hey everybody, and welcome to Your Spiritual Best Friend. I am your host, Josh Sanchez, and I'm here with a very special guest all the way from Costa Rica, Yogi Aaron. Aaron, how are you doing today, and what's going on?
I'm doing really well, thanks. What's going on? I'm just hanging out. I went to the gym this morning. I've been working all afternoon, and now I'm talking to you and enjoying the beautiful sunset. So life couldn't be better.
Oh man, sunsets, aren't they the best? And especially, I bet in Costa Rica, those sunsets must be really beautiful out there.
It is. And it's this time of year where our kind of fall is a little bit different. And the leaves are changing. And so the way the sun just hits, the color of the leaves is just it's mesmerizing. It's hypnotizing. So yeah, life is good.
I mean, yeah, that sounds great. I will say maybe that's something where in the future I'll plan a far trip or something to Costa Rica. Who knows, I love to travel. So
Costa Rica is going to be closer than you think.
Definitely. Well, Aaron, I just want to say first, before we really get started with our podcast today, thank you for reaching out and wanting to come on to the podcast. It definitely means a lot. And just starting us off when it comes to just my first question, when it comes to some things you're passionate about, Aaron, and tell me a little bit about that, the discovery of your passions.
So one of the things I'm really passionate about, which I kind of mentioned to you earlier, is yoga. And just kind of allowing or helping people to find out the potential of what yoga can be. And it's, for me, yoga And the practice, not like trying to put your foot behind your head, but the actual practice of yoga is this beautiful kind of journey that helps people to find out and actualize their purpose in life. There's so many people like Tony Robbins and different, motivational speakers. And basically, if you kind of like distill a lot of what they are saying down to like the essence, it really comes from the yogic philosophy. And I've always been the kind of person that, while I value people like Tony Robbins and the work that he's doing a lot, I like to go to the source of it. And for me, the source comes a lot from like the yoga scriptures and teachings, which is like turn your attention inward, and there you find all the answers. And one of my friends who's a yoga teacher, we were talking the other day and just commenting on how as yoga teachers, there's such an addiction like with us to teaching yoga, because when that light of recognition sparks in people, you can see it. It's just visible, like a person's whole entire being just lights up when they have that spark of recognition and hear, purpose knocking at the door of their hearts. So that's what I'm really passionate about in a nutshell. One thing.
Of course. And Aaron, like I can definitely feel that passion as you're describing it. And one of the key things you mentioned in your answer is when you are working with people, you see like that passion, or like once they figure it out, like you see that it's like a light switch, and they're all of a sudden they're like really getting what you're teaching. And that just leads me just right to my next question. So when it comes to getting into yoga, like what led you down that path? Did you have like a mentor you looked up to, or was it like something you were very passionate about at a young age? Like what led you into yoga?
That's a very interesting question. When I was growing up, I grew up very religious, dogmatic religion. And I'm just going to leave that there. But as time went on, my mother became very kind of quote unquote new agey. I told you I grew up in Vancouver, and that's where, the land of my mother would always say the nuts, fruits, and flakes end up. Those granola eating people. And by the way, I make really good granola. And so by the time I was 18, 19, 20, I was really kind of like anti-spiritual at that point. I just wanted to live my life. I didn't really want to, ask the big questions. But I was also very athletic at that time. And I was probably like most people experiencing tightness in my muscles and thought that stretching was the answer. And that's what got me into yoga. I thought, well, I'll go to the gym to work out. I'll go to yoga to stretch. And I always thought like yoga will keep me healthy and mobile and, and what was interesting, by the way, was shortly after that, I really injured my back. And you have to keep in mind, I was like 18 at this time. So that was kind of shocking to me. And it would really take about 25 years for me to figure out that the stretching and was kind of exacerbating issues in my body that I didn't understand were there. But I got into yoga, and as I got into yoga more and more, it just became more of a spiritual practice for me. I went to India. I've been to India like 10 times. I've studied with masters there. I've continued to study. I've had teachers that have really influenced my journey here. And then, of course, that led me to opening up Blue Osa, which is my yoga retreat center in Costa Rica. About 5 years ago now, so when I was around 45, I ended up in a surgeon's office, an orthopedic surgeon's office, who was telling me that he thought I might need a spinal fusion in my lower back. So my lower back had gotten so bad that there was a herniated disc that was pressing into the nerves and then shooting pain down my legs. And by the time I ended up in his office, I could barely walk. And so that was kind of like a huge wake up call for me to kind of like go, maybe I'm doing something that isn't working. And I have to tell you, like, that was a big kind of moment that was really hard for my ego. So much of my identity was wrapped up in, being this yoga person that could stretch and could do these amazing poses. And then here I was completely crippled by the time I turned 45. And as a side note, like I've seen a lot of other yoga teachers exactly like in that age range end up going to the hospital for knee replacement, for hip replacement, for shoulder surgery, you name it. A lot of us yoga people are walking around bionic by the time we turn 50. And that kind of like journey led me into asking the question, well, what should I be doing? And it took me down this road of muscle activation technique, which was created by a guy named Greg Roskopf, who's out of Denver. And it just basically kind of opened up my eyes to two things. One, I needed to stop stretching and stop teaching it. So really, since then, I haven't taught stretching or stretched in 5-6 years. And the other thing was that this whole idea of muscle activation, and that kind of like took me into answering this question, well, how do we start to get people more activated in their bodies, like more that their muscle, to improve their muscle function. So that's kind of my story in a nutshell, which then led me to writing my book, Stop Stretching. So whenever anybody asks me what kind of advice you've got for people, it's always stop stretching.
Of course, Aaron. First, I just want to say, like, thank you for being so open and honest, because in those moments, especially moments where you mentioned like your ego was put into question, because you spend so much time stretching and getting into yoga and doing some great poses, to find out, that physically, your body was hurting, was definitely like a big shot to the ego. So first, I just want to say thank you for being honest about it, because that can be a very hard self-reflection, like especially like putting our egos aside, because, we've put so much work, time, and effort into something. And then for it to go into question, that can definitely be a big like you mentioned, that big realization moment. So I just want to first say thank you for being honest with that, because I know that can be hard. As a side note, like I work as like a counselor with a lot of people, and that's like the first step, is just pushing that ego aside and being honest with yourself. So I just want to first just to give you credit for that. But Aaron, like I just wanted to just add, because I know you mentioned like advice when it comes to like stop stretching, but let's say like, because I know you've been a teacher for so long, so let's say like you have like a new student, just coming in, just learning the basics of yoga and stuff. What's some advice that you would really give to them to just help them along their own journey through yoga and connecting more spiritually?
That's a really loaded question.
Of course.
So I'm just thinking like, I mean, there's so many things I could say right now about that. I mean, like I said, it's a huge question, but where my mind immediately went to is when I'm leading yoga teacher trainings at Blue Osa, and people are coming in and it's the very first day, and I'm kind of setting the ground rules. I don't like using the word rules too much, but they are rules. They're really guidelines that we all agree to keep the safe space for everybody, right? But the very first rule or guideline is accountability. And, it's not like we say like it's a truth. It's more like a cherished belief that we take on, that we're accountable for what shows up in our life. And we use what shows up in our life as a reflection to kind of A, learn from it, but also B, to choose how we're going to react. And, as we begin any kind of spiritual practice, and I lump a lot of things into this term spiritual practice, It can be going to church, religiously once a week or dedicatedly once a week. It could be like meditating every morning. It could be going to AA meetings. So spiritual practice can be so many things for so many people, maybe giving up alcohol for 30 days or, starting a new exercise routine, Monday, Wednesdays, and Fridays. So spiritual practice can mean a lot of things, but one of the ideas in spiritual practice is that there's a sense of heat or tapas that comes out of it, this kind of friction, and that friction is like what helps us to grow and helps us to kind of like unearth, our inner radiance, and that to help us shine in life. And a lot of us run away from that friction, and we blame our teachers, we blame our counselors, we blame people in our networks. We are very easy to blame others. And unless we're really willing to accept, this kind of cherished belief of accountability, we can never really grow, because then we're always kind of constantly pointing the finger outwards in life. And my second rule or guideline is don't complain and don't explain. And I bet you'll never hear another yoga teacher say that. They'll come up with other things, but I'm very unique in that way.
Okay, Aaron, yeah, especially that second rule, like don't complain and don't explain.
Yes.
Could you elaborate a little bit more when it comes to like that mindset a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, like not complaining is a very powerful spiritual practice that for many of us, we have habit patterns in place, and our habit patterns, create our personality, which then ultimately create our life. And so if we want to change our life, we need to start changing, little habits. And a lot of people get very ambitious and say, I'm going to do this and I'm going to be this. We don't need to do that. Just kind of do micro changes. And for me, the don't explain, don't complain kind of rule is like so micro and yet so profound, because so many of us immediately go into, complaining about something or feeling like we have to explain ourselves. Like I would just prefer coffee with cream because of blah, 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 blah. Or I don't eat meat because of blah, 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 blah. You don't have to say all that stuff. Just say, I don't eat meat. Boom. Or I don't like that. And it allows us to just say what we mean and mean what we say. And it also allows us to have more clear, concise, and direct communication.
I like that point, Aaron, like especially because being more direct like that, it like you said, it does create like that clear, concise communication. I know for myself, I definitely have had that habit of just over communicating, or over explaining, like I'm doing this because of this. And that can be very exhausting. It can be very tiring. And just being direct and honest, practicing that can really help solve a lot of things, and for yourself, so that way you're not as stressed with trying to explain everything to everybody. So I really like that last piece of not only the second rule, but also the first rule too.
Yeah.
That accountability is also very important as well. Being honest with yourself, being able to reflect on yourself, things you're doing well, things you want to work on. That accountability is very important. And we cannot lose that. Like you said, like we love to point the finger at others and blame others for our wrongdoings. And some situations are pretty valid, but everybody though experiencing anything, you need to have your own sense of accountability for all of that. So I really like those two rules, Aaron, and I can definitely see why you've been able to run a very successful yoga teaching practice for quite some time now. Because I know you mentioned 5 years in Costa Rica, but how long have you been a yoga teacher overall?
I started teaching, I've been teaching for almost 30 years, and I've actually owned Blue Osa, which is, well, let me back up a second. So I moved to New York in 2001. Before that, I had sort of been teaching yoga on and off. It really wasn't like a career path. And then I decided, like, I mean, that's a whole story about how I ended up in New York, but I basically picked up the world map and said, spun it, and my finger landed on New York, basically. And I moved to New York just to teach yoga, and that kind of led me to opening up a studio. When I moved to New York, I moved there with like no money. So I really started from nothing, and then started like this kind of big movement, if you will, in yoga. That kind of led me to doing retreats around the world. And one of the places I ended up was in Costa Rica. And then from Costa Rica, I moved here in 2010. So we're entering our 14th year of business right now at Blue Osa. It's a nice life if you can get it.
Oh, definitely. And like that, like my apologies for saying 5. That's definitely a very long time. You've been in the field and stuff. So the fact that you've been in there for so long, it just shows you again the rules that you go by. It's working. It's helping people, and that's definitely really good to see.
I just want to add one little thing to that is that, a lot of people say like this yoga stuff is woo woo, and, they make all kinds of, explanations about why they don't do it. But, in one of the words of my teacher, you follow the practice. And people say, well, how do you know if the practice works, teacher? And I always, whenever anybody asks me that in my yoga studio, I just turn around and say, look, the practice works. These guidelines work if you use it. And, but you have to use it, and you have to work hard. And one of the paradigms I think that doesn't get talked about enough in the yoga world, especially in the yoga world, because people think like if you're spiritual, that means that you have to sit around all day smoking weed or doing nothing or being passive. But yoga is actually the practice of becoming actionable in life. And I don't think that gets enough press. But yoga is the practice of taking actionable steps and doing work. And we look at like the great teachers of yoga, and they all said the same thing: go out, work hard in life, do your duty. And this is not a practice for sitting around doing nothing. So, but the practice does work. And, I don't have my beautiful view that I normally point to, but you can get the picture.
Hey everyone. This episode is brought to you by Podcash as a collaboration between Racket and Stir. Podcash gave away over $100,000 to up-and-coming podcasters as a way to support insanely creative and inspiring podcasters. We know how difficult it can be to get a podcast off the ground and running, but with Podcash, it's a great way to get cash, and best of all, it's all free for your podcast. So if podcasting has been on your to-do list or you're already a podcaster, go to podcash.com to stay up to date with future podcast happenings. That's again, podcash.com, podcash.com. I hope to see your future podcast. Of course. And Aaron, I really like that piece of wisdom as well, because I definitely think that is definitely a topic that needs to get more press, like you said. Of when we think of spirituality, like you mentioned, like a lot of spiritual practices, you mentioned the term like woo woo, and also like very just like you're supposed to relax, and like the practices, they help you with relaxing, but in terms of the productivity and the stuff you need to do, like that does not stop. Like we need to continue to be productive. We need to continue to put ourselves out there in the world and be our best selves, do the things that we enjoy and we love doing. So I definitely think that is definitely a good spot on point, that there needs to be more press when it comes to that. So definitely. But Aaron, I just want to say I really appreciate the first like main part of our conversation. Just before we wrap up this first part and we transition to the next part of our conversation, I know you mentioned your book. When it comes to your book, I know that's definitely a journey, trying to create the book and stuff. Can you talk to me a little bit of that process, like what led you to the book and the process of even creating your own book?
So, for the record, I've actually written two books. My first book was my autobiography, which is called Autobiography of a Naked Yogi. And then this book, which is called Stop Stretching, a New Yogic Approach to Master Your Body and Live Pain Free. I would say that my second book was a lot easier than my first. My first book took me 8 years to write, basically, and a lot of like putting it down, coming back, putting it down, not sure, a lot of self-doubt. I can write like a 3,000 word essay pretty quickly on a topic I'm passionate about, but writing about myself was the hardest thing I've ever had to do in my life. And like I said, it took me 8 years, and the book is not that thick. It wasn't that many words, but there was a lot of self-doubt in that journey, and just kind of wondering, like, who's going to want to read this, and are people really going to find this interesting? But with my second book, Stop Stretching, it did happen a lot faster, mostly because I had written a lot of the content beforehand, and and the it just like when we decided to start putting it together, it just all sort of came together like really effortlessly. So it was just very easy to do that.
Okay, I got you, and that's I just want to say thank you for your honesty. Especially I can imagine that first book. Just like writing about yourself. I know I had to do an assignment for trying to remember for one of my classes in graduate school, and that was definitely a very stressful time period for me. It was just writing about yourself, being honest about yourself. It was definitely a big challenge. So as you were describing that, I was like, yeah, I can definitely relate to the challenges of that because it's hard to write about yourself. I could write research papers like on the fly, but then when it
Yes.
came to writing about myself, it was such a challenge. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Absolutely. It's not easy. And, I would just say to anybody who's wanting to write a book, I mean, you just got to do it and find your kind of like way of doing it, which is not easy, of course. But it is, you get support, get people around you. And one of the things that I've been very fortunate about is always in my life is to create like a lot of support networks around me that, people that really truly cherish me and then also want to see me succeed. And that's also been a huge part of my own personal success, if you want to say that, is just having people around that really help lift me up. And I can't stress that enough. Hold me accountable.
Of course, Aaron, and I definitely think that is a perfect transition to our next part of the conversation. So I know we talked a lot about your journey, and I really appreciate your openness to sharing your experiences and also just challenges you've had to go through, whether that's through your career and also through creating your book and stuff. I know you mentioned towards the last part of your answer just some qualities, people holding you accountable,
Yeah.
like the people around you. So my first question is, what are some things that you really look for in a friendship and even like a romantic partner?
I look for congruency, probably more than anything. Whenever I meet somebody, whether it's romantic or whether it's just personal, like as a friend or an acquaintance or a business person, I'm always looking for congruency. And what that means to me is like, do they mean what they say? Is what their actions are matching their words? Because a lot of people say a lot of things, but their actions don't necessarily align with that. I'm always reminded, I think it was Ralph Waldo Emerson that said, "Who you are speaks so loudly, I can barely hear what you're saying." So I'm always paying attention to what people do and how they are rather than what they say. So that's probably first and foremost. And then also, like, I'm a very much a listening kind of person. I take a big interest in people, and so I kind of, as I've gotten older, I've been starting to pay attention to that. Like, do people reciprocate, and how do people reciprocate? And everybody reciprocates differently. So I think it's important not to put too much, I guess, expectation on it. But because we do that a lot, we project our expectations. So I'm careful not to do that per se, but also, like, are they reciprocal in the way that they listen and also kind of care, showing care back.
Of course, Aaron, and those are definitely some great qualities to look for in a friendship and even a romantic partner too. I like your term congruency. It's definitely a term that really stands out to me. And obviously, like relationships, it's a lifelong journey. We're learning things about ourselves when we are in relationships, whether that is with a friendship or even romantic partner. There's definitely a lot of takeaways you learn, through your relationships. Talk to me a little bit about your journey and some things you've had to learn throughout your own relationship experiences, helping others, friendships, and even like romantic partners.
Oh my goodness. What have I learned? I've learned so much. I think one of the things that I've learned a lot is, like, whenever I'm pointing a finger at somebody, three are always pointing back at me. And so that's one thing I've learned. I've also learned, like, I always tell people my greatest two lessons in life are learning compassion and learning patience. I think I've got the compassion thing worked out, kind of, through a lot of my own sort of the battles I've had to face. I think the biggest one was when I was, in my younger years, I used to get really impatient with, like, slow people, and probably not so compassionate towards slower moving people. And then I got hit by a boulder in the Himalayas and had to have a group of people carry me 27 kilometers to help. And then going through that healing process after that, and it kind of made me aware of how much I'm going to use accountable language right now, but how much I think have gone through life, like saying, judging others or saying to other people, like, you should be like this or you should be like that, but never really walking in their shoes. And I think that, through divine intervention, I was forced to, like, experience what it was like to literally be disabled and, and have to kind of experience what it's like to have that experience in life differently. It made me see life, oh my God, so differently. And to the point where I have so much empathy now for people that struggle as they go through their life and in whatever way that they're having to deal with their body and their issues. So being compassionate and being patient. Patience is still something I'm working on. I have to just say, like, as a teacher, for some reason, divine intervention again gave me a lot of patience as a teacher, but everywhere else in my life, it kind of disappears. And the one big place sometimes I think, like, oh, I'm becoming a good yogi, I'm becoming a better person. And then I get in my car and start driving, and then I find out I'm not such a good yogi anymore.
Of course, Aaron, and I always found that interesting too, especially like with people that do a lot of teaching and helping other people. When it comes to, like, when they're teaching, like, they're very patient, but then in their personal lives, it definitely can lead. I mean, obviously, like, we all reach a point, we can only be patient for so much,
Yeah.
but whether that's driving or some, like, other things too, but the main takeaway through everything, is we're constantly learning through our relationships, through our interactions with people, just new things about ourselves. And it's really good that you've taken the steps to reflect. You've built that compassion. You've learned and you realize some things, like building that empathy for other people, understanding their own perspectives because of the certain situations you went through, like getting hit with that boulder at the time. It must have been very life changing for you, like you said, like you're a go getter, like you're very fast moving. And then that situation happened and you had to really like slow down. And that was something
Yes.
you've really had to learn. So, it just seems like through your experiences, like you're constantly learning new things about yourself, which is really great to see. So I just wanted to highlight that.
Yeah, I think also like, one of the other big lessons I've learned, especially in relationships, but I think even in the broader sense is, which has become sort of one of my mottos in life is seek first to understand. And anytime I kind of hear somebody I disagree with now, or they say something like that makes my like skin crawl or, whatever, like I just kind of feel that flame of disagreement inside of me. I immediately like quell it and just turn to them and say, tell me more, because I really want to try and understand, where you're coming from. And that's kind of helped me to, it's actually doing that has changed a lot of my viewpoints on so many things. And not to be such a rigid person in some of the things that I think or the ways that I believe certain things.
Definitely. And just like I mentioned before, it's just that you're constantly learning because everyone has their own perspective on things, and we're never going to 100% agree with everybody. Like
Yeah.
we're constantly, especially for you, being a teacher, like you're constantly meeting people from different perspectives, different ways of life, different, they always bring their own unique perspective on the things, and you're just constantly learning. So it's definitely good to see, as a teacher, like being able to keep an open mind, try and understand where they're coming from, and learning some new things too. That's definitely really nice to hear and to say.
Yes.
Um, but my last question, just wrapping up this part of our conversation, and I really appreciate your honesty and openness through your experiences with relationships and also just like life in general. When it comes to advice, let's say someone is struggling in a relationship or they're in a clash, in their relationship. What's some advice that you would really give to them, to, just like work on that relationship and also like, figure out what's really going wrong in that relationship. If you get what I'm saying with the question.
Yeah. It's that, I mean, that's a tricky question because I think it just depends on, the person and what situation they're in. Um, I mean, sometimes for me, I think that we're conditioned in this world today to run away from relationships so easily. And there's just the ability to have new relationships, whether it's friends or romantic, has become so easy. And, it's not like 100 years ago where we lived on this remote farm and were forced to stick with each other thick or thin. And that ability to leave a relationship today has never been easier. The only thing that stops us mostly now is our emotions, our emotional attachment, and we are able to disregard that. So, but I also say this without judgment because I don't know people's different situations. But I would just say like stick in it as long as you can to kind of get what you came for. And maybe at the end, when you come out on the other side, you find out what it is that you really need. And maybe that person is the right person. We're so stuck on this idea of Mr. Right. And then we get into that cycle of Mr. Right now. But relationships are not easy because we have to work, not because we have to work with the other person, because we have to work on ourselves. and learn to be accommodating with the other person. And it also comes back to, I think, seek first to understand, understanding the other person and really, really hearing what they're going through, and being a witness to their pain and their struggle. And it kind of, that has been something that has helped me to overcome my own sort of ego, and sense of what I think, how I think things should sometimes be going.
Yeah, Aaron, I just want to say that's some great piece of advice, and my apologies with the question because I know like it can depend on so many situations and scenarios, and yeah, I definitely think your answer was really spot on though, like just relationships, no matter what relationship you get into, it's going to be a lot of work. You're going to put in a lot of work, not only for the other person, but for yourself too. It's a relationship, it's two people, and that's going to be a lot of work. Like there's going to be mistakes throughout the relationship. Like no relationship you're going to go into are you going to meet someone that checks every single box perfectly, like not that's just not like realistic, and there's going to be moments where your relationships are going to hit some blocks, and you got to be able, if you want to stay in a relationship, put in the work. It all depends on the situation obviously, but generally speaking, like relationships, it takes so much work, and um, those are some things that I really I got from your last answer, so that was some great piece of advice. Of course, of course. Now, Aaron, before we wrap up everything, for this last part of the conversation, I always love to add a little astrology element to the podcast. And like I mentioned before, I really appreciate just your honesty and openness to from your advice to also just being open for like and honest with yourself and your experiences. So I really appreciate that. But when it comes to your astrology chart, I always like to start with this first part. So this reading, it's according to the horoscope.co. It's a really fun website. All it does is I just Google your sun and moon. Your sun sign is obviously like your ego to the core, like your core roots. Your moon is your inner world. So it's all about like your emotions and what's going on inside. So it's really cool. You have your sun, which is the ego, and then you have the moon, which is the inner world. So for you, Aaron, you are an Aquarius sun, Pisces moon, and it says an unconventional personality. So as I give this reading, it's going to give positives, negatives, perfect partner, and advice. And once I'm done reading, just let me know how you feel about everything. So I should have said that first. My apologies. My apologies. Um, But yeah, so for your reading, it says an unconventional personality. So again, you're an Aquarius sun, Pisces moon. So eccentric and fascinating, the Aquarius sun, Pisces moon personality raises more than a few eyebrows, but deep inside, these people are affectionate and have simple needs. When it comes to positives for your sun and moon combination, very responsible, original, and sophisticated. Negatives can be questioning, restrained, and skeptical at times. Perfect partner, someone who accepts their eccentricities. Sorry, it took me a little bit to pronounce that word. And word of advice for your sun and moon combination, to be careful about the quality of their perception. So, as I give you your positives, negatives, perfect partner, and advice, what are some thoughts that come to mind?
I mean, it's pretty bang on. I mean, I don't know if you could have read another sun sign, or another combination, and I would have went, oh, that's me too. But I'm very eccentric, but it took me a long time to accept that part of myself. And yeah, there was like a few other things that you said. I was like, ding, ding, ding.
Yeah, and just like I tell everybody, when it comes to astrology, just view it as like another tool in the toolbox, to understand yourself, and
Yeah.
just continuing when it comes to your chart. Um, One of the things that's very important in astrology is for people just starting, wanting to get in. So I know I mentioned your sun and moon, but there's another part like your rising sign. So this is the type of energy you want to present to the world. It's your rising sign is your first house, which involves the house of self. So, like I mentioned, this is the energy you want to present to people, the energy you strive towards. And I can tell from our conversation just I already, before I looked at your chart, I had a feeling of what your rising was going to be just by the way, like you present yourself and you talk about yourself, and yours is in Sagittarius. So Sagittarius is a very like Sagittarius is a philosopher. So these people are very like passionate people. They're very free spirited. They really like to but they have that philosopher act like quality to them. So like they like to teach and help others too. So it's like you love to learn and learn so much new information, but then you also want to teach that amongst others and be there for other people. Sagittarius it's one of the signs that's very optimistic about the world and optimistic about people and very social about people. So to have that as your rising sign, that's definitely like the energy you want to present to people, the energy you strive towards. So when I mentioned all that I talked about when it comes to that rising sign, how do you feel about that overall?
Yes, I'm definitely a philosopher. Absolutely. I've been like that since high school. I remember I started like a little kind of like new age self-help club where I would lead people through guided relaxations and talk about the meaning of life and goals and purpose and vision boarding. So, and that part has always been a part of my life. Even when my mother has a picture of me when I was about 4 years old, and I lined up, and this was back when we were going to church and very religious, but I had all of my stuffed animals lined up, and I would be giving like Sunday service to them when I was 4 years old.
Oh man, so yeah, so you're helping people literally from the get-go, which is great to see, I bet you those are some like lifelong stories, that you and your family always, share and cherish. Like remember when you were four and you just wanted to help people? Um definitely. One of the because there's a couple other things too that stand out in your chart that I want to just highlight. First, just when it comes to, I know you mentioned in your answer, especially about relationships, you talked a lot about how you're still working on that patient aspect, right? And Venus in our chart. So Venus is the planet of like love, obviously. So it's like qualities we look for in partners and also challenges we could present to ourselves in our relationships. And your Venus is in Aries. So Aries is a very fiery, self-starting, passionate type of energy. But the thing with Aries is they move so fast, right? Because they're like go-getters, they're self-starters, they're motivators, very ambitious, And if you have too much of that ambition, it can lead to a lot of impatience. So when I saw that in your chart, I wanted to highlight that right away. And house numbers. So house numbers, they tell you where you're going to feel the energy. Um, and your Venus is in your fifth house, which involves like the creation aspect. Creation can be, whether that's the physical creation, but also actually like creating art and expression. You know, creativity can also be problem solving. It can be anything. It's the idea of creation. So when it comes to that, especially in relationships, I know you mentioned impatience beforehand. How do you feel about that overall when it comes to that, whether that's impatience, ambition, that drive in your relationships?
That's funny you say that because I always tend to attract people that are a little slower in life and a little bit more sedentary. And I always find like that interesting. And I'm like, why am I always attracting these people? Probably because I need to be grounded a little bit more. And they're, of course, attracted to me because I am very fiery and I'm making hashtag making shit happen in life. Yes, absolutely. That's really funny how you
Of
nailed
course.
it.
Of course, of course. And just one of the last things, because I know when it comes to anyone's astrology, Charlie, we could probably do a whole separate podcast on it alone, because there's so much you can look into it. One of the last things I just see from your chart right away, just from a quick first glance, is you have four placements in your third house. So your sun sign, your Mercury, your North Node, and as I'm looking, and another planet, my fault, yeah, because there's so many. So you have four placements in the third house. So the third house involves local community, communication, peers, colleagues. So it's like a lot of people in your local community. Also, communication is a very big aspect in here. And your sun sign is in the third house. So when it comes to that communication and building like that sense of local community, has that been something you've been very passionate towards? That ego is really like, it really fuels your ego, when you are communicating, when people communicate well, obviously, and also like that local community aspect.
Yeah, I mean, I've always been trying to create community all throughout my life. When I was a child, it was sort of present, mostly because of church and the way my family raised me. And then I went to a boys' boarding school. And then when I moved to New York, I created a yoga studio, which was really like a home base for a community. Then I moved to Costa Rica and opened up a yoga retreat center, again, community. So it's always been a main driver in my life. And then, of course, communication. Yes. I mean, Aquarians are known to be the communicators of the universe. So I've heard.
Yeah, definitely. With Aquarius energy, it's all about that humanitarian work. Like, like Aquarius is, generally speaking, because we mentioned a lot, like you have a lot of other signs in your chart. But one of the core qualities for Aquarius is, like they love to think, bigger picture, like future oriented, how am I going to affect the group instead of just one individual person, So that's one of the core qualities that Aquariuses have. They tend to think bigger picture, and they look for more of how can I help multiple people instead of just helping, one person,
Absolutely.
So definitely. But Aaron, I just want to say thank you for a wonderful conversation, your openness, and also being, open to share your own astrology chart. I know it can get very personal, so I really appreciate everything. Where can everybody check out your work, your books, and all that fun stuff?
Yeah, everybody, and basically two things. One, go to Amazon and search Stop Stretching. My book will pop up very quickly. But also the kind of gateway to there's a lot of free practices that I have and pain-free practices on my website. So yogiaaron.com, AARON. And yogiaaron.com is the gateway to everything. Yogi Aaron and pain-free practices.
Perfect. And I'll make sure, again, Aaron, I'll make sure to put the links to everything in the show descriptions. That way you guys can check out all of Aaron's work and all that fun stuff. But Aaron, I just want to say again, thank you for a wonderful conversation, and please stay safe all the way there in Costa Rica.
Thank you so much, Joshua. Appreciate it.